Hello and welcome to the show. So, turns out Daniel has work experience this week. I didn't find out about that till quite late. So, yeah, today's video wasn't quite what was planned, but never mind. It's an interesting one, nonetheless, and something that I wanted to do. Hopefully, the rest of this week should be all normal. It was just today's, we kind of ran out of time. Anyway, today, yes, we are going to be investigating something. This is something I've always wondered about Forza 4. I've never got around to actually sort of trying to find out, and that is about the tyres. If having warm tyres is actually better than having cold tyres. Now, for any of you who have played sort of simulation PC games, I'm thinking like R Factor and iRacing and that sort of thing, with some of the cars it is very, very noticeable, especially sort of like the Formula cars, Indy cars, that you want to warmer tyres over the cold tyres. The car handle a lot differently. On Forza, the distinction isn't really particularly massive, but there could be a small amount of time sort of gain or loss depending on it. So we are going to have a look, and we're going to sort of try and find out what the answer to the question is. Now, for this to work, we're going to try and keep things as even, as fair as possible, keep as fewer variables as we can, because, yeah, we want it to be as accurate as we can get it. Now, the first thing, the important thing, is consistency. You need to be able to do consistent lap times to really test this properly. Now, I'm going to be honest, I am not a robot, I am not the fastest person on Forza 4. I am relatively quick, and I'm using Iberian here because it is a track that I know very, very well. Yeah, I'm not going to be on top of the leaderboards, but I am fairly good, I would say, especially at these tracks. So I'm going to give this a go. It's more of a, I guess, for general purposes, not for the like top guys. But still, I can do fairly consistent lap times around here with these cars. And, of course, to make things kind of fair as well, we are going to be doing 3 runs with each car. So, for each of the warm laps, for each of the cold laps, there will be 3 runs. It's sort of just in case one goes a little bit wrong. So, you have like a nice average. I'm sure people who have done science at school will know about making averages. Yes, ideally we would do more tests to get a better average. The more tests you do, the better. However, this took so long to do as it was with just 3 runs. Any more runs, it would take just too much time. So I think 3 is a good average. We've got a good idea of how things are going to work. Now, as you saw there, that was me just warming up the tyres on this Hyundai. Each car had 3 laps to warm up its tyres. The tyres got to about 200 degrees something or other. I'm not sure what Forza uses to measure. On these warm-up laps, yeah, again, there's going to be a little bit of difference between the temperatures each time you start. Very little I can do about that. Each time it was about 200 blah, blah, blah. I'm sure I was speaking English a second ago. Each time it was around sort of 200 something or others, whatever Forza measures in. Now also, as you see on the start there, I was sort of doing it as quickly as I could. Once I got the car into position, didn't wait very long. The idea is just try and keep as much temperature as I can in the tyres for this. So yeah, when it started it was about 200 degrees. I've talked a little about this car actually. Hyundai Genesis is a car that I actually quite like. I think it's a very underrated car. It suffers a little bit from having a Hyundai badge, which is a bit of a shame, because I think this is a very good car. It's a very fun car to drive, and it even looks alright. It has a nice engine. I think they have V6s in them, if I remember correctly, which I might not have done. It's a very nice car to drive, and it's quite fun. It's quite interesting. And as you see, there we go. The first run was complete with the Hyundai. I also had it in a fantastic green colour. There wasn't a huge amount of silly colours to choose from today. Anyway, run number 2. As you can see, I'm really bad at manoeuvring this car. Where are we going? I'm manoeuvring this into position. I was using the second place grid slot for this because it was on the racing line, really. I wanted to be that side of the grid. I've really parked very terribly. Didn't realise how wonky that was. Never mind. Yeah, as you can see, I was putting the cars on the right-hand side of the track, left-hand side on the screen, just for a better line into the first corner. I thought I might as well. When I was sort of moving the cars, you see there I was stalling a little bit. I was trying to keep wheel spin to a minimum, so I don't warm up the tyres too much. You'll also see me occasionally sort of leaving the car on the grid a little bit just to let the tyres cool down. I think this was starting at about 112, 114 on the tyre temperatures. Again, it will vary a little bit on that. Maybe if I span the wheels up a little bit more when I was moving the car. It's very hard moving cars little distances when the clutch is a button. It doesn't work very well, so you'll see a fair few stalling cars. But yeah, that's the only sort of major sort of difference I would say, or major factor. The temperatures will vary a little bit, aside from my driving, which I did okay for me. I'm not, as I said, I'm not sort of robot-like consistency. I can't do identical laps again and again, but then very, very few people can. I do know these tracks fairly well, so I would say I'm fairly consistent around here. And there we go, the Hyundai is across the line again. As I said, we did 3 runs. I did 3 runs, sorry, with each of these cars, and now it is time for the lap times. The Hyundai, this was an interesting one, especially for a first one. In the first run, it was a 1 minute 5.7 for the warm tyres, and the cold tyres were quicker. That doesn't make sense. That confused me. Second run, I was getting a bit faster, 5.3. Cold tyres were 5.5 again, and the final run, it was a 4.8 and a 5.0. So difference-wise, not a lot in it. I'm going to be honest, I think most of that would probably be down to driving more than to the tyres. I mean, yeah, there is a couple of tenths maybe in favour of the warmer tyres, but to be honest, with that sort of a smaller difference, I would say that is probably more down to driving than it is to the tyres. But it's looking like there could be at least some sense that the sort of difference between the tyres. Now we move on next to a supercar. We've got the Lexus LFA. I will also point out now that all the cars we were using are rear-wheel drive. This was basically to keep another variable the same. We could use front-wheel drive cars, however they kind of run out at B class. I think there's a stay at A, but that's about it. Or we could use four-wheel drive, but they don't have very many racing cars. So to give us the sort of greatest variation in cars to use while keeping the drivetrain the same, we're going to be using rear-wheel drive cars. The Lexus comes in the worst colour of all of the cars that I drove today as well, I have to say. This horrible browny goldy colour. It's hideous. Why would you spend an awful lot of money on one of these and have it in this colour? I really don't know. The Lexus isn't my favourite of the supercars. I think it's a bit too expensive for what it is. It does sound incredible. I do like the engine in this, but it's not really my sort of car. I'm going to be honest. It is a good car though, don't get me wrong. We have a little bit of a moment over that jump. That jump is so nasty with cars running simulation steering. It's to do, well, basically when you land. If you don't land perfectly straight, you are in an awful lot of trouble. I've seen it many times when we race V8s around here. It's a very nasty jump. Anyway, the Lexus did its lap times. I don't think you just want to see constant driving around the circuits. And these are the times. This one was very interesting. A little bit confusing as well. On the warm tyres, it was incredibly consistent. 58.4s for all of them. On the cold tyres, it was anything but consistent. There were a couple of 59s and there's a 58.5 in there. Yeah, this one confused me. I have to say, actually, out of all of the cars, the Lexus is the most noticeable. There we go. Difference between the cold and warm tyres. When you're driving it with the cold tyres, you can just feel it starting to slide a little bit more than it would. I think the 58.5 was just a very, very good lap from me, if I'm honest. 59, sorry, sort of low 59s, high 58s are probably a fairly good average. So it's starting to look a little bit more plausible that the warm tyres do have a bit of an effect. Anyway, we move on next. Of course, we have to use a V8 supercar for the race car. This is a car that I know very, very well, and a track which I know very, very well. Trying to manoeuvre it into place took a little bit of time. Now, this one is an interesting one again, because, well, one, it's a race car. It has a lot more power. Actually, I don't know how much more powerful it is than the Lexus. But it has a lot of power and not very sophisticated power delivery. It just wheel spins an awful lot. Again, I love V8 supercars. I've talked about these cars a lot. They are fantastic cars to drive, fantastic cars to race, because they are pretty mental. I'm going to be honest. There isn't a huge amount of aero on the things. There is an awful lot of power, and they are very tricky to drive. To be honest, if you can drive one of these without traction control, you can probably drive anything. Maybe sort of like the Ultimate Aeros, them sort of things, because they have over 1,000 horsepower. Probably a little bit trickier to drive. For race cars, these are by far the most tricky. But I think that's sort of rewarding. Being able to drive, getting one of these around the track is a sort of challenge in its own, let alone the lap times. But yes, as we see, we're going around the final corner now. I really do like driving these cars. These are an interesting thing for this tyre point, sort of using race cars for the tyres, because they're going to be running sort of more race tyres. All these cars are standard. I didn't change anything on them, so I would presume that a V8 supercar, is going to be running race tyres, whereas a Lexus will be on road legal tyres, and the Hyundai will definitely be on road tyres. So we have a look at the lap times. With the warm tyres, again, it's fairly consistent, 55.7s and then two 55.4s. On the cold tyres, it is relatively consistent with two 56.2s and a 55.9. yeah, all the times on all these tyres, I was pretty happy with the lap. There was nothing noticeable wrong with any of the laps. I think that is just a genuine difference, and I think a lot of the reason on this comes down to the start. Getting one of these cars off the line is very, very tricky, and I think having the warm tyres gives it a slight bit more sort of grip with the rear tyres, which means you can launch it a bit faster. And that gives it a kind of an advantage because these cars are incredibly tricky to get off the line. Anybody who's ever raced one of these, you will know how tricky these things can be to launch. Now we move on to another car. Now we're going to change the track up a little bit just to sort of make things more interesting, see how it fares on a different track. We are again going back to a C-Class car. This time it's something a little bit different. We've gone to a BMW M3. Now, by changing the track to this, it adds some sort of different challenges into the mix. Iberian is it's a very fast circuit. Most of the corners are sort of third gear with very little braking. I mean, you don't get to huge sort of high top speeds, but then you also don't have very many slow corners. There's not a huge amount of braking involved. There is just, yeah, it's a lot of medium speed corners, I guess. But you are flat out for quite a lot of the lap. Here, things are very different. First of all, it's a very hilly track. Iberian has sort of like one hill, but the rest of it is very, very flat. Here is a lot of up and down section. It's also a much longer lap. Will that play a part? Well, possibly, because with the cold tyres, by the time you get towards the end of the lap, they will probably have heated up to a sort of reasonable temperature. There are also a lot more braking zones here. There are a lot heavier braking zones, especially down into the hairpin at the end of the lap. Because on Iberian, I mean, you don't really get past third gear, maybe, unless you have a car specifically tuned for their third or fourth gear at the end of the straight. It's probably as fast as you get. Around here, there is a lot more chance to get up speed, and the corners are, in general, high speed. Through this section here, the corners are pretty fast. I do like this track as well. Again, this is another track that I know very, very well, and I tend to go very quickly around here, which is why I chose this one. I know it well. I can be fairly consistent. This corner is one of the most fantastic corners in Forza. I just love that corner. It's an insanely scary corner, especially in faster cars, because you can't always quite take it flat out, but you always want to be going through there flat out. And when some of the cars will get some really fast speeds through there. Anyway, as the BMW comes towards the end of one of its laps, I have to say I do quite like this car. It is quite a nice car to drive, quite an interesting challenge around here, I have to say. And we're going to, no, cameraman, go over there. There it is. And the BMW is parked. Now, this is a lower PI car. I think it's slightly lower than the Hyundai Genesis. It's also the oldest car, I think, that we have had here. We have a look at the times now. This one's interesting. This one is incredibly close. Fairly consistent. I was getting faster towards the end as I was getting more used to the track. But the differences between the warm and the cold are tiny. And we're talking, what is it, 0.1 of a difference? The most, 0.2, sorry, at the most from the second run. The first run, the cold tyres was fractionally faster as well. I think, I'm going to be honest, sort of a sort of small part of the conclusion. Really, the lower PI cars, I don't think it makes a huge amount of difference. You saw with the Hyundai and with this, now the times are really so close, and most of that could probably be accounted for my driving. Anyway, we move on next to another supercar. This time, well, it's inevitable this is going to be in here. Come on, it wouldn't be a first gear video without some sort of muscle car American super thing. This is the Dodge Viper ACR. This is, it's not really a muscle car. It's quite how I can never decide how to classify this. It's based on what I would call a super muscle car, but this is a supercar, and I would say this is closer to a track car, to be honest, because it's, well, A, it looks ridiculous with one of the biggest rear wings, probably the biggest rear wing with the exception of the Audi R8 LMS. The wing on this is just huge, and there is huge amounts of aero, and this is incredibly good through the corners. This is a phenomenally fast car. Well, this is an S-Class car. I mean, it's about 650 PI or 653 or something. And it's essentially mid-S-Class, but it's incredibly fast. We had it around our track, and it was beating some of the R3 cars. That's how fast this thing is, because it is so good through the corners. And of course, you've got a big, well, 600 horsepower V10, so it's pretty fast accelerating and pretty fast in a straight line. So this is a little bit different to the LFA. The LFA is a very quick car, very quick around a track. It had one of the fastest times at Nürburgring. But I would say this is a better handling car. There is more downforce. The LFA is a lot more willing to go sideways, I'm going to be honest. This thing, despite the fact that it has got a huge engine and is very powerful, it really does not go sideways unless you sort of use the handbrake, or maybe in first gear you might get it to go sideways a little bit. But yeah, it's a fantastic car to drive, one of the best value for money cars, with the exception probably of the Ultima, which we forgot about when we did that video. Yeah, it's really, really good. Considering this is 100,000 credits, it's incredibly fast. And there we go, the Viper, the first run from the Viper is all done. And now it is time to see what sort of lap times we were getting from this thing. Again, I know this car fairly well. I've driven this car quite a bit, so I was relatively consistent. As we can see here, there is about 0.3 of a second difference with all of them, I have to say. You can see we're doing 21.3 to 20.7, 6/10 of a second difference over 3 different laps. I'm fairly happy with that. And we look at the cold tyres again, is about 6/10 of difference overall. And yeah, there's about 0.3 of a second difference between the two of them. It's a fairly consistent difference, I have to say. I would say with that car there, I mean, it's not particularly noticeable. It's not like the LFA where you could feel it sliding a little bit. This car here didn't really feel like a huge amount of difference, but the times speak for themselves, and it is a fraction faster on warm tyres with this car. But again, quite a lot of that could probably be down to driving, or could be down to driving. I wouldn't say it is, it could be down to someone driving. Now next, we move on to a Ferrari 488 Italia Racing GT3 car. This is not my sort of car. I tend to race A-class and sort of B-class cars. They're what I tend to stick with. I enjoy driving them cars, and I'm fairly quick with that sort of class of car. The main exceptions to that are, I do like the ACR Viper. I do kind of race S-Class occasionally. I'm not a particularly big fan of that, to be honest. And I love the V8 Supercars. But the V8 Supercars I love because of their mentalness. They're not a sort of traditional race car. In fact, they're touring cars. They're just sort of touring cars on steroids. They should put big V8s in British touring cars. That'd be fun. But yes, I think I've gone off subject a little bit. Yeah, GT cars I am not particularly good with. I don't spend a lot of time racing these cars, so I haven't really had the practice like I have with the V8 Supercars. So my driving is not as consistent with these. I would have done this test with like LMP cars, or maybe even something like the GT2 cars, but I am just not fast enough with them. I'm certainly not consistent enough with them to give them a sort of a fair test. So I chose the Ferrari as well. I think these GT3s, I can't remember, it's all confusing. I chose one of the lower sort of PI, slower as well, GT cars. But again, this really isn't my sort of car, so the consistency is a little bit of an issue with this one. But I thought I'd do it anyway to sort of give you a sort of an idea. As you can see, I was having a little bit of issue with this car. This corner is fantastic in the Ferrari, I will say that. It's fantastic through there, because it's just such a scary corner, and it's also very, very high speed through there. Final corner, an awful lot of braking is done in this corner. Makes things a little bit different from Iberian, because you're going quite high speeds into that. And then we've just got one more corner to go, and there we go, the Ferrari is across the line. And yeah, it's quite nice for a GT car. The Ferrari is okay. I like the engine in it, which is why I picked it. But there we go. Now it is time to see my horrendous lap times with this car. This was the least consistent of all of the cars. I somehow managed to, yeah, it's a little bit of a weird one. With cold tyres, it was pretty good. I was only like 0.2 of a second difference. On the warm tyres, I had like 1 and a bit seconds. I don't know how I managed to get that 16.4. There was just one of those laps where you get everything absolutely perfect. Around 17.1 is probably a good sort of thing for the warm tyres. The first run was me being a little bit rusty, I think, with the car more than anything. As we can see, though, again, there is a little bit of sort of favour, I guess, with the warm tyres, even with this Ferrari that I'm not particularly fantastic at driving. So there we go. We've had 6 cars on, well, different tracks and all sorts of different cars. We've tried to keep things as scientific and as fair as possible, keep as fewer variables in this as we could. Now, conclusion-wise, well, for cars sort of under C or C-class and under, I would say that it really doesn't make any difference. I mean, you saw with the Hyundai and the BMW, there's only sort of 0.2 of a second or less difference with the cars. I really think for anything under there, there's just such a tiny difference that it's barely noticeable. B-class, B and A-class, I'd say there probably isn't a huge amount in that either. Once we start getting towards the supercars, there does seem to be a little bit of a difference between the times for the LFA and for the Viper. There does seem to be a little bit of time gained by using a warm tyre, but again, it's not massive amounts of time. And we look at the R3 cars, the GT cars, again with the Ferrari, even with a bit of wonky driving from me, it does seem to be a little bit quicker on the warm tyres. The V8 Supercar does seem to be fairly consistently quicker. I mean, there was a fair gap for that one. I think a bit of that at least is down to the start, because a lot of that, the V8 Supercar is such a tricky thing to get off the line. A lot of that will come down to the start for that one. So I think we have been informative for once. It's amazing. The warm tyres do make a little bit of a difference. Anything under C-Class, you can ignore it. But they do seem to make a little bit of a difference. But to be honest, it is a small amount. It's not massive. It's still going to come down to your driving. It's far more important than whether the tyres are warm or cold. You know, because we're already talking fractions of a second, whereas you getting all your lines right around the track will make up much more than that. So there we go. That is it for this video. Thank you very much for watching. As ever, if you have challenges or something you would like us to investigate, please do leave it in the comments section. We will have a look through and we will pick our favourites. However, until next time, goodbye.